This is the blessing of being chosen by God. It is, God isn't going to let things go by. When we're distant from him in our purpose, when we're distant from him in what God is calling us to do, when we're distant from God, God has a way of reorienting us back to him. God has a way of realigning us back to him. And so this is the blessing of it, because if God is bringing me back to him, even in the midst of the difficulties and the trials and the tribulations, God, through all of that, is getting glory through it, but he's realigning me in it as well, because God's glory comes with my restoration in my relationship with him. God isn't just punishing you just to punish you. As a matter of fact, God doesn't punish you by his grace. This is not punishment. This is about realignment. And I think it's interesting because many of us, we sometimes look at things that happen in our lives and we think that it's because God is punishing us. Like, oh my goodness, I made a mistake, and because of that mistake, I'm suffering this. It must be God is punishing me. No, there's a rule to this. There's an order to this. There's a law to this. There are decisions that you make that have consequences, but here's the blessing of it, is that the consequences draw us closer to God. It's a realignment. It may be painful in a season, but God is realigning us. God isn't going to leave you where you are. He's not going to leave you in the midst of your brokenness and pain. God isn't going to leave you, in a place where you've got no hope. Even in the midst of pain, you're not hopeless, because God is working out his glory and his justice. God doesn't punish you. God realigns you. He reorients you. He refines you. He does all that because in the end, when you have gone through it all, when life has brought its trials and tribulations, when life has challenged you in ways, brought suffering and pain, when you get on the other side of that, he says you will come out as gold. He is refining you, that he may see his glory through you. I think many of us need to understand that, because Israel has made some poor decisions. And in making some poor decisions, have faced the same consequences that all the other nations have made. Because Israel's running on a set of rules and a set of laws that are not God's rules and are not God's laws. And now because Israel finds himself here, in this place, Israel goes back to Isaiah. And Israel reads Isaiah over and over and over and over again. You see, Isaiah was read over and over again because Isaiah helped them understand why they're here. But Isaiah gave them hope about what's to come. They would read Isaiah over and over again. Israel was under Roman rule, under the Roman Empire. No enfranchisement. And yet in the end, Israel continued to read this over and over again. We have to read this from the perspective of the Hebrews and the Hebrew people. To read that over and over again, because we have to understand this wasn't about us. This is about them. And because it was about them, we have to look at it from their perspective, their vantage point, their view. They're reading this, and what they anticipate is someone who's going to come and make all this right. None of this is right, but someone's going to come to make all this right. I'll say this real quick. As long as humanity progresses, as long as humanity moves forward, we should never lose hope in humanity. People will say, I've lost hope in humanity. They just don't understand how God sees humanity. People who've lost hope in people don't know what God sees in people. And while many of us may have lost hope in humanity, God's got a plan for humanity. God's got a plan for people. God's got a plan for each and every person. God's got a plan for people collectively and individually. God hasn't given up on humanity, and God has put his promise on humanity. And if God has put his promise on humanity, we cannot give up on humanity or lose hope in humanity. Anybody who's lost hope in humanity doesn't know what God sees, and doesn't know the promise of God, and doesn't know the plan of God, because God ain't done with humanity. God is not done with you. He's not done with me. If he begins it, he will complete it. God is not done. These people see where they are, but they know that God isn't done and that God is doing a work, and they're anticipating what God's about to do. This is the hope of Israel. Israel is hopeful. Imagine now Israel being, Israel going through centuries, from decades to centuries, with very little rights, seen as people who are of no significance. Imagine what that looks like for you to go from generation to generation to generation in your own land, but under someone else's rule, someone else's government. Imagine being people who have been made powerless, disenfranchised, and now your only hope is in these words. Your only hope is in the one that is to come. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach the good tidings to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted. He's talking to them. To proclaim liberty to the captives. He's talking to them. And the opening of the prison to those who are bound. He's talking to them. Let me sit on this for 1 minute, because this is so critically important. Jesus said, I came for the lost sheep of Israel. Jesus uttered these words. Jesus entered and dwelled. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten, full of grace and truth. Jesus was who Israel was waiting for. And yet Israel was so broken. Israel was in pain for so long. Israel was so jaded that Israel rejected the one who came for them. I have one question for you today. And this is for a lot of us who are here. There's folks in here right now who are watching this. Have you been so hurt, so jaded, so frustrated that you've become hopeless? Have you become so jaded that even when Jesus shows up, you're quick to respond in rejection? Have you become so jaded that even when Jesus utters these words and says, he sent me to heal the brokenhearted, that's me. He sent me to preach good tidings to the poor, that's me. He sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, that's me. There's some people who know exactly what this looks like, exactly what this is, and you're saying to yourself, that's me. He's talking to me. And yet he was talking to them. And even though he was talking to them, they've been poor for so long, brokenhearted for so long, captives for so long, bound for so long, that when Jesus gave something that would set them free, they said, run this man off a cliff. Notice that up to this point, as we're reading it, this is a matter of justice. This is a matter of God bringing justice. This is a matter of God making things right. This is a matter of all the things we see broken in the world, all the things we see that isn't right in the world, that God is saying, hey, I've got a new thing that I'm doing. I want to bring restoration to this. And yet God wants to bring restoration to it, but he wants to bring restoration to his people who will bring restoration to it. And he says to them, the Gentiles, because when I finally make this good, when I finally make this right, look what he says in Isaiah 60 verse 1, when I finally make this right, you won't need light, you will be light. When I finally make this right, you won't need the sun because you will have the sun. You won't need the moon to shine over you because you'll have light already in you. You won't need something on the outside to help bring light for you on the inside because you've got something on the inside that's going to illuminate to the outside family. When you experience the fullness of Christ, man, oh man, you don't need anything on the outside to give you peace on the inside. There's so many of us who right now we find ourselves in the midst of darkness. We find ourselves in the midst of depression, and we're looking for something on the outside to help bring light to us, not realizing that Jesus is our light and he brings it from the inside. And when we receive him, we become light, bringing light everywhere we are. If we're in darkness, turn on the switch. Just trust in Jesus. And Jesus is saying to them, the Gentiles shall come to your light, meaning you're not only going to give yourself light, not only are you going to become light for yourself, but you're going to become light for everybody else around you. You're going to bring life to everybody else around you. You're going to bring hope and peace and joy to everybody else around you. You're going to bring restoration to everybody else around you. People are going to they're going to gravitate to you because they see light in you. And he says in verse 3, the Gentiles shall come to your light and the kings to the brightness of your rising. This is what would happen. This is what Jesus was bringing. He was bringing something that's bigger than them, greater than them, that gives them eternal joy, eternal peace, not politics, not religion, not any of that, but Jesus. And when Jesus came to offer that to them, they rejected him. So even in this chat right now, there are people who, like I told you, there's a militant anti-Christian sentiment. There are people who come and they'll come angry, militant. Reality is that a lot of them, they have good reason to feel the way they feel because they've gone a long time either broken by what are lies, because religion has a lot of lies, broken by the things that happened in church, broken by the things that had transpired in their lives that has somehow been connected to whatever it is you call church or whatever it is you call Jesus. They're angry. They're hurt. And so it's no surprise that when you offer Jesus, they do just as Israel did. Rather than hearing what Jesus has to offer, they're quick to throw him over the cliff, when at the end of the day, what we all want is to be made whole. What we all want is to be restored. What we all want is to be a light. And it's when we receive that and we get to know what Jesus really is, who Jesus really is. We get to know what it means to be a follower of Christ, not a member of a church, not any of that, like a follower of Jesus. We know what that actually means and that how that's actually lived out and how that brings restoration to not only people in our cities and our communities, but all around the world, and how we begin to see how it's in my work that Jesus is moving and it's in him that I live and move and have my being. It's in all of that. When we begin to see that, that's when when we see the purity of that, wholeness, restoration, reconciliation, when we see justice, righteousness, like when we actually see it, not politicize about it, not shame people or guilt people into it, not any of that, but when we actually see it, Look what it says that happens to them. He says in verse 6, but you shall be named priests of the Lord. They shall call you the servants of our God. You shall eat riches of the Gentiles, and in their glory you shall boast. He wants to make you a priest. Do you know what a priest is? A priest is simply someone who mediates for God. That's it. It's a mediator. Someone who steps in as a representative. That's what a priest is a representative of God. We're the ones who make priests, the guys who wear the collars and all that. But it's not that, actually. That's actually unbiblical. We're going to do a Bible study tonight about that. So join us on Patreon for that. We're going to do a Bible study tonight on that. But that's not what a priest is. The priest is the people. We are the priesthood. We are actually each and every one of us, we are priests, representatives of God who show the world what God is like. It's not about religion. It's not about institution. It's about Christ. So who are you today? Are you the ones who ran Jesus off a cliff? Or are you the ones that say, let me follow this guy some more and see more about what this guy has to say? You don't have to ever come back to this life. You don't have to ever come back to this life. You don't have to ever attend this live again. Okay? You don't have to ever attend it. All right? Go find him for yourself. It will change your life. Every person who's angry and upset, how about you actually don't take anybody's word for it? Actually ask him. Ask him. And you'll find healing for your soul. You'll find wholeness, the wholeness that you're looking for. You'll find purpose and meaning to what God is already calling you to do. Love y'all, fam.